There is a fluid running through your spine right now. It bathes your brain. It cushions your spinal cord. It circulates in a rhythmic pulse, expanding and contracting, rising and falling in a wave that moves through your central nervous system, approximately 8 to 12 times every minute without pause, without rest, from the moment you were formed in the womb until the moment you take your final breath. Modern neuroscience calls it cerebrospinal fluid. Ancient yogic tradition called it the river of consciousness, the vehicle of awakening, the medium through which the dormant divine energy coiled at the base of the spine rises, when the conditions are right, up through the 7 energy centers of the body toward the crown of the skull and the seat of the highest human awareness. They called this rising energy Kundalini, and for thousands of years, the masters of this tradition said with absolute consistency that there was one practice above all others that determined whether this energy remained coiled, dormant, and unexpressed at the base of the spine, or whether it awakened, rose, and transformed the man who carried it into something that transcended the ordinary limits of human experience. That practice was the conservation of sexual energy. What I want to show you today is not a choice between the ancient framework and the modern science. I want to show you that they are describing the same biological reality from 2 different vantage points, and that when you understand both simultaneously, the picture that emerges is more extraordinary than either tradition alone could produce. Stay with me, because this goes deeper into the biology of your own nervous system than anything you have likely encountered before. Let us begin with the cerebrospinal fluid itself, because most people know almost nothing about this substance, despite the fact that it is one of the most biologically significant fluids in the human body and one of the most actively researched areas in contemporary neuroscience. Cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, is produced primarily by specialized structures called the choroid plexuses, located within the 4 ventricles of the brain. Approximately 500 milliliters of CSF are produced daily, continuously replacing the total volume, which is only about 150 milliliters at any given time, roughly 3 to 4 times every 24 hours. CSF is not simply a passive cushioning fluid. Modern research has revealed it to be an extraordinarily active biological medium performing functions that researchers are still in the process of fully mapping. It removes metabolic waste products from the brain through what researchers now call the glymphatic system, a recently discovered brain-wide waste clearance network that operates primarily during deep sleep and that depends entirely on healthy CSF circulation for its function. It distributes neuroactive substances, hormones, growth factors, neurotransmitters throughout the central nervous system. It maintains the precise ionic environment that neurons require for optimal electrical function. And it carries information, chemical signals between brain regions that operate through CSF-mediated volume transmission rather than direct synaptic contact. The quality, composition, and circulatory dynamics of CSF are directly governed by the body's hormonal environment, its autonomic nervous system tone, and its overall physiological state. A body in hormonal balance, with high vagal tone and low chronic stress, produces CSF of optimal composition and optimal circulatory dynamics. A body in hormonal dysregulation, with low vagal tone and chronic cortisol elevation, produces a CSF environment that is measurably less supportive of optimal neurological function. This hormonal dependency of CSF quality is the first critical link in the chain connecting semen retention to spinal fluid biology. Now I want to bring in the craniosacral connection, because this is where the biology becomes genuinely extraordinary and where the ancient description of energy moving through the spine begins to map onto something that modern practitioners of craniosacral therapy and osteopathic medicine have been documenting clinically for over a century. Stay locked in, because what I am about to describe is the mechanism that bridges the ancient yogic framework and the modern neurological one with a precision that is almost impossible to dismiss. In the early 20th century, osteopathic physician William Garner Sutherland made an observation that fundamentally challenged the prevailing medical understanding of the skull and spine. Through years of careful observation and clinical practice, Sutherland documented that the bones of the skull are not rigidly fused in adulthood as previously believed. They retain subtle mobility, moving in a rhythmic pattern that corresponds to the pulsatile circulation of cerebrospinal fluid through the central nervous system. This rhythmic movement, which Sutherland called the primary respiratory mechanism, operates at a rate of approximately 8 to 12 cycles per minute, independent of breathing and heartbeat, and is palpable by trained hands at virtually any point on the body. Its quality, its amplitude, its symmetry, its freedom of expression directly reflects the functional state of the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system that governs it. Sutherland's work gave rise to craniosacral therapy, a clinical discipline now practiced by thousands of licensed osteopaths, physical therapists, and body workers worldwide, whose fundamental premise is that the quality of CSF circulation through the craniosacral system is one of the most fundamental indicators and determinants of overall neurological and physiological health. What is the craniosacral system? It is the continuous biological unit formed by the skull, the meninges, the three-layered membrane system that envelops the brain and spinal cord, the spinal column, the sacrum, and the CSF that circulates through all of them in this continuous rhythmic pulse. This is the biological structure that the ancient yogic tradition described as the primary channel of Kundalini energy. The Sushumna Nadi, the central energy channel of the yogic body, runs through the spinal canal from the base of the spine at the sacrum to the crown of the skull. Its anatomical correspondence to the spinal cord, the meningeal system, and the CSF circulation pathway is precise enough that researchers in the field of yoga and neuroscience have increasingly concluded that the ancient description of the Sushumna is a phenomenological description of the craniosacral system experienced from within through meditative introspection rather than observed from without through anatomical dissection. Now here is where semen retention enters this picture in a way that is both biologically specific and experientially profound, because the connection between sexual energy conservation and the quality of CSF circulation runs through mechanisms that modern physiology documents with increasing clarity. This is the part that most people in this conversation have never heard explained at this level of biological depth. Do not go anywhere. The sacrum, the large triangular bone at the base of the spine that forms the posterior wall of the pelvis, is the inferior pole of the craniosacral system. Its mobility is essential to healthy CSF circulation. The rhythmic rocking motion of the sacrum, its flexion and extension in response to the CSF pressure wave, is the driving mechanism that keeps the craniosacral rhythm flowing freely through the entire length of the spinal canal to the skull. The sacrum is also, and this anatomical relationship is rarely remarked upon but deeply significant, the bone that houses the sacral nerve plexus, the primary nervous system control center for the reproductive organs, the perineal musculature, and the entire pelvic floor. In a man who is chronically engaging in sexual activity and ejaculation, the sacral region carries specific patterns of tension, energetic holding, and autonomic nervous system activation that directly affect sacral mobility and therefore CSF circulatory dynamics. The chronic activation of the sacral reproductive circuits, the constant cycling of sexual arousal and discharge, keeps the pelvic floor and the sacral region in a state of repetitive tension and release that over time can compromise the subtle mobility required for optimal craniosacral rhythm. Practitioners of craniosacral therapy and osteopathic medicine who work with the sacral region consistently report finding restriction patterns in this area in men with high ejaculation frequency. Patterns that, when released through therapeutic intervention, produce profound effects on the quality of CSF circulation throughout the entire craniosacral system. What semen retention does to this picture is biomechanically elegant. As the sacral reproductive circuits are no longer being repeatedly activated and discharged, the chronic tension patterns in the pelvic floor and sacral region begin to release. The sacrum recovers its natural mobility, the inferior pole of the craniosacral system frees up, and the CSF circulation, no longer impeded by the subtle sacral restriction that chronic reproductive cycling imposes, begins flowing with greater amplitude and greater freedom through the entire length of the spinal canal toward the skull. This is the biological mechanism behind what the ancient yogic tradition described as the awakening and rising of Kundalini energy through the Sushumna. The CSF circulation, freed from the restriction imposed by chronic sexual discharge and the tension patterns it generates, begins moving with greater vitality through the spinal canal, producing the characteristic sensations of warmth, tingling, and upward-moving energy that Kundalini practitioners describe and that retention practitioners report with remarkable frequency in the intermediate stages of their practice. Now let us bring in the neurochemical dimension, because the CSF is not merely a mechanical fluid. It is a chemical medium, and its composition changes significantly based on what the body is producing and secreting into it. The choroid plexuses that produce CSF are not passive filters. They are active secretory organs that selectively transport specific molecules into the CSF from the blood, and specific molecules out of the CSF into the blood, according to the body's metabolic and neurological needs. Among the molecules actively secreted into the CSF by the choroid plexuses are, and this is where the connection to our earlier DMT conversation becomes direct, tryptophan and its metabolites, including serotonin precursors and potentially DMT itself. The choroid plexus has been identified as one of the tissues with the highest expression of the INMT enzyme required for DMT synthesis, meaning the fluid that bathes your brain and spinal cord may itself be a vehicle for the distribution of endogenously produced tryptamine compounds throughout the central nervous system. What this suggests, and what the ancient traditions described in their language of subtle body chemistry, is that the quality of the CSF as a neurochemical medium is directly relevant to the quality of consciousness it supports. CSF enriched with optimal concentrations of neuroprotective growth factors, tryptamine compounds, and hormonal signals produces a neurological environment that supports depth of awareness, clarity of perception, and the subtle but profound shifts in inner experience that long-term retention practitioners consistently describe. CSF depleted of these compounds, in the chronically stressed, hormonally dysregulated, repeatedly ejaculating man whose tryptophan metabolism is impaired and whose choroid plexus function is compromised by chronic cortisol exposure, produces a neurological environment that is the biological substrate of the gray, flat, motivationally depleted, perceptually diminished state that characterizes the chronic depletion experience. The fluid running through your spine is literally carrying a different chemical message depending on the state of the biology that produces it, and that message shapes every aspect of your conscious experience from the inside out. Here is what I want you to sit with for a moment, because this convergence between ancient yogic anatomy and modern CSF neuroscience is not something that gets discussed in either the spiritual community or the scientific community with the seriousness it deserves. The spiritual community often dismisses the biology. The scientific community often dismisses the ancient framework. But when you hold both simultaneously, when you see that the Sushumna Nadi is the spinal canal, that the Kundalini energy is the CSF circulation, that the chakras are the major autonomic nerve plexuses along the spine, that the crown experience is the neurochemical transformation of the brain when the CSF environment is optimized, the dismissal becomes impossible from either direction. This is not metaphysics, this is anatomy described from the inside. Let us talk about the chakra system specifically, because its anatomical correspondence to the autonomic nervous system plexuses along the spine is one of the most striking and most underappreciated convergences between ancient yogic anatomy and modern neuroanatomy. The 7 chakras of the yogic system are positioned at 7 points along the spinal column, from the base of the spine to the crown of the skull. Modern neuroanatomy identifies 7 major autonomic nerve plexuses positioned at virtually identical locations along the spine. The coccygeal plexus at the base, the sacral plexus in the pelvic region, the solar plexus at the navel, the cardiac plexus at the heart, the pharyngeal plexus at the throat, the cavernous plexus behind the eyes, and the cerebral cortex at the crown. Each chakra in the yogic system is described as governing specific physiological functions, specific emotional states, and specific qualities of consciousness. And these descriptions correspond with remarkable accuracy to the known functions of the autonomic plexus located at the same spinal level. The root chakra, Muladhara, is associated with survival, physical security, and the reproductive drive. The sacral plexus at this level governs reproductive organ function and perineal musculature. The sacral chakra, Svadhisthana, is associated with sexual energy, creative drive, and emotional fluidity. The sacral nerve roots at this level govern the entire pelvic reproductive system. The solar plexus chakra, Manipura, is associated with personal power, digestive fire, and the will to act. The celiac plexus at this level is the largest autonomic ganglion in the body, governing digestive function and the adrenal stress response. The ancient yogic teaching about Kundalini is that sexual energy, concentrated at the two lowest chakras corresponding to the reproductive nerve plexuses, when conserved rather than discharged, gradually rises through the successive nerve plexuses of the spine, activating each one in sequence until it reaches the highest centers of the brain and produces the state of expanded consciousness called samadhi. In neurobiological terms, the autonomic activation and neurochemical enrichment that begins in the pelvic reproductive nerve plexuses when chronic sexual discharge ceases gradually propagates upward through the spinal autonomic system, altering the neurochemical environment at each successive plexus level until the neurochemical and electrical changes reach the brain itself and produce the measurable alterations in consciousness that practitioners report. This is Kundalini, not as metaphysics, as neuroscience described from the inside by practitioners who had no anatomical vocabulary for what they were experiencing, but who documented it with extraordinary precision in the only framework available to them. There is something I want to say to you now that comes not from research papers or ancient texts, but from the simple human truth at the center of everything we have discussed today. You're not just a body moving through the world. You are a nervous system carrying a river of consciousness through your spine, a river whose quality, whose vitality, whose chemical richness determines the depth and the aliveness of every moment of your experience. That river can run clear and full and vital, carrying the neurochemical signals of a body in hormonal balance, a nervous system in genuine rest, a brain receiving the full biological support it needs for the deepest and most extraordinary expressions of human awareness. Or it can run depleted and chemically impoverished, carrying the hormonal and neurochemical signatures of chronic stress, chronic loss, chronic biological resource hemorrhage that leaves the consciousness it supports gray and flat and somehow distant from its own experience. The ancient yogis mapped this river with extraordinary care. They called it the Sushumna. They called its vitality Kundalini. They called its full expression enlightenment. And they pointed directly at the practice of sexual energy conservation as the most fundamental condition for its full and vital flow. Modern neuroscience is mapping the same river with different instruments. It calls it the craniosacral system. It calls its vitality vagal tone and CSF circulation and neurochemical optimization. It is beginning to document what the ancient practitioners knew experientially, that the biological conditions for the highest expressions of human consciousness are built through specific, intentional practices of conservation and cultivation. You carry this river in your body right now. You carry the biological potential for states of awareness and aliveness and depth of inner experience that most people never access. Not because those states are reserved for the extraordinary, but because the biological conditions for them are systematically undermined by choices made daily without awareness of their consequences. Those conditions are yours to build, beginning now, with the practice that every tradition worth its name has pointed toward for 5,000 years. The river is waiting to run full. Let it. If this opens something in you today, if it gave biological grounding to experiences you have had or glimpsed or sensed were possible, please give this video a like right now. It helps this reach the men who are ready to understand what is moving through them. Share this with someone who is on this path or ready to begin it. The biological framework in this video might give them the scientific grounding that makes the ancient teaching finally land with full force. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep going to these depths together. Every video here is built with the same commitment to precision, depth, and the convergence of ancient wisdom with modern science. And thank you, from the deepest place, for bringing your full attention to this today, for being willing to consider that the most extraordinary territory available to you is not somewhere out in the world. It is running through your spine, right now, waiting. Stay flowing, stay rising, stay awake. See you in the next one. Stay flowing, stay rising, stay awake. See you in the next one.